Welcome to episode 51 of the Voices of Boyle podcast. Today, our guest is Greer Mac Keogh, who has been passionately documenting the rich history of the Royal Hotel through stories, photos, videos and other memorabilia over the past number of years. Her project, called In These Rooms, will be showcased in a 2-week exhibition starting on Saturday, 31st of August at An Ríoga. Interestingly, this episode was recorded on August the 7th, marking the podcast's 2-year anniversary, so it was the perfect topic to record on the day that was in it. So let's get into it, and I hope you enjoyed the chat I had with Greer. Greer, you're very welcome to the Voices of Boyle. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Carlo. Yeah.
So over the next maybe hour or so, we're going to talk about the Royal Hotel, about the project that you're involved in, which is called In These Rooms, and it documents the history of the Royal. But before that, maybe can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to Boyle?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I'm from Dublin and an artist, and my connection to this area started in a kind of around 2015-16. My uncle bought a house over on the other side of Coot Hall, on the way into Carrick there, and we were just coming down to visit and taking a trip. I think it was a kind of Christmas time. As I recall, it was quite kind of grey and cold, and we were coming in to Boyle for lunch, and that was the first time I saw the Royal Hotel. It was like a kind of a monument in town, and I looked at it and thought, well, that's a super interesting building, but didn't really give it much more thought until sort of later in 2016. So I think that was kind of around Christmas 2015.
So that was the kind of the start of your interest in the Royal?
It was like the first time I'd been to Boyle.
Oh, okay. That was your
for
first
this
time.
lunch.
Right.
Yeah. And we were in a place up at the top on the Crescent. I think it was called Bruno's. It's not there anymore.
That's correct, yeah, it's not.
Yeah. We went for lunch, and to be honest, it was more the general architecture in Boyle that I was sort of struck by, and the Royal Hotel obviously being at the heart of the town, but in the main a kind of really uninterrupted row of old shop fronts and signage, and just thinking about the sort of history of these buildings and wondering, do you think if I came back to Boyle, would people be interested in talking to me about the architecture? And as it transpires, they did. And there was lots of very willing people, and people were very generous with their time. So the first trip that was a kind of specific research trip was actually funded by the it's a fund by the Arts Council called Engaging with Architecture, and they have a little research and development fund. So if you have an idea, you can apply, and they'll give you some money to go and sort of do the field work. And I'm sure many people remember that there was a beautiful summer in 2016. Maybe they don't, but when I came down, everybody said, God, you've brought the beautiful weather with you. And it was just full 2 weeks of just sun. It was amazing.
The Royal was closed at that stage as well.
The Royal was closed. It was in a kind of, it hadn't degraded, I don't think, as much as it sort of did in sort of 1819, where I think once the roof came down and there was quite a lot of rain, it really started to discolour. Whereas at that time, when I came in 2016, it was an unusual set of colours, like quite yellow and red, but it didn't have the sort of darkened, sort of dilapidated look. It just looked kind of stationary, stopped in time, as did some of the other shops in town. It was like they just one day paused or something, and I was kind of interested in trying to start those stories again, or to hear about the stories in the building.
So that was kind of your introduction to Boyle, to the Royal Hotel, and then from that you got some funding.
Yeah.
So this is an independent kind of research project that you've taken, is it, or is it part of something bigger?
It's kind of it's part of something bigger in many ways. In that, what happened in 2016 was that I was taken on a number of different kind of walks, and so Christine took me on a walk up to a dolmen, and Barry took me on a drive out to Lockheed. And I suppose I didn't come down with any specific questions. I had a hunch that there was something interesting in the buildings and the architecture, but I had what I suppose is called an open brief. An open brief kind of was started by, it's a concept created by a set of artists in the UK, actually, called the Artist Placement Group. And they would say, here's an artist, let's put them into National Rail. So not a gallery, not a space where you might normally find artists, but a completely other kind of space, and just see what that artist comes up with when they're talking to people in there. And the idea is that you kind of go with no preconceived notions, and that was the idea. And so I just listened and asked people, and they took me on different journeys and introduced me to different parts of the landscape and the history, and all that became this research project, which formed the kind of basis for my PhD then.
Okay, so it's part of your PhD then.
It kind of grew out of this idea that in one town, there might be stories that would speak to both that rural place, but also nationally and internationally about hospitality, Irish hospitality, and welcoming people. And the Royal became this kind of starting point for conversations, both about the Royal itself, but also about hospitality and Irishness more generally.
Okay.
And I think, so I've been coming and going, and so I was here, and then some of those first kind of conversations I had in 2016, they're still alive within the research now and within the project now, and are still important threads. But then in 2018, I came down, and as part of the Arts Festival, I did some kind of more structured interviews like we're doing here. And that was when I kind of got a chance to focus more in on the Royal itself, rather than just a kind of general thing in and around about the architecture of Boyle. Because actually what had happened in 2016-17 was that all of my conversations that I was having with people ended up with them talking about the Royal, because it had been closed, and it was this sort of there was just, you could feel there was this sense of loss in the town of this space. And because I'm from Dublin, growing up, I would have gone to one particular venue for a christening. I'd go, to a different venue for a wedding, never the same place for a birthday party, always in different places. And buildings don't have that same universal quality as a social space like the Royal had. And I think now, I think part of what I've tried to do is sort of capture that, or create a kind of, to kind of hold on to some of the essence of what a social space like that is for a rural town. And that became apparent quite quickly, actually, that this space was just this really significant building. And, I heard on many times you didn't have to think about where to hold something. It was always the Royal.
That's true.
So as an outsider, I think part of that distance from understanding it habitually, like, as a place growing up, meant that I was just so intrigued to hear all the stories and to sort of piece together for me what having a space like that would feel like, or be like, or what so I suppose that's that kind of following the little narratives and the stories is part of what's kind of happened over the last kind of 5 or 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
And then how those stories have kind of
Materialized.
Yeah, and generated, sparked interest in other areas and thinking, like this, it's been quite a kind of organic, but also, it's kind of unfolded.
So when you initially came to Boyle, so it was more or less like a general overview of the architecture, and then through an organic transition, it became more focused on the Royal.
Yeah.
So then, as a result of that, we have the In These Rooms project, which is what the project is called. And in a nutshell, then, what would you consider to be the main goal? Yeah, the main goal of the project.
So I suppose within these rooms, it's the kind of research project that was meandering and down Irish hospitality and over to lots of different avenues sort of coalesced around this idea of In These Rooms when Roscommon Council purchased the building, and there was an end in sight, or at least a kind of coming around of the story. I think initially when there was still a lot of uncertainty about the building, I wasn't sure whether the archive would end up anywhere. That the idea that if I didn't want to make anything of the research until there was a kind of sort of a place for it to end up.
Yeah.
And so obviously when the council bought the building, it was great because I had this
end goal or
feeling that all these stories and everything can find it can. In earnest, I sort of felt like, okay, well, let's start collecting, and let's start thinking about how to present the materials, because we have somewhere for it to be exhibited and to be shared back with the community. And
we will get to that about the exhibition that's on the 31st of August before we end.
Yeah.
Can you describe then the process of gathering stories, photos, and memorabilia that you're going to have on show at the exhibition?
I mean, I think what I suppose I'd want to let people know that it's not going to be like a heritage exhibition, which will start in 1782 when John Freeman built the Royal, and then running chronologically to today, because I suppose at one stage I was kind of looking at a timeline and I realized, well, actually, time sort of exists and flows differently for everyone, and I'm never going to get like an exact set of dates, and the history isn't something that I think it's much more interesting to tell it in a kind of anecdotes and in stories rather than to go for a kind of more traditional chronological overview of the building. So, but what I have done is tried to think about history as being sort of layered, and how the past is in the present, and to map, I suppose, or layer and collage the old with the new, and the stories of the past with kind of images of the present. And so there's a lot of imagery of the hotel as it was when it was stationary, and as I've only ever known it when I first saw it, which is as a kind of vacant kind of space, with the kind of liveliness of all these stories and objects, and I suppose love and adoration for the building that I encountered through people talking with me. And I've always really held on to this idea that buildings aren't kind of inert objects, that they have a kind of residue or a sort of history imbued within them, and that, like, this sort of old plaster and wallpaper crumbling off the Royal, with every layer of that paper there's like a different story of Irish hospitality and of Boyle and of travel, and there's sort of a great kind of dynamic thing about a building like that, because it has a very local function, and the local community, as you know, obviously used it for all sorts of reasons. But then it also has a kind of transient quality. So there's all these sort of people coming from different places, and so it's kind of serviced so many different people across its history. And me, even though I never got to stay there, I still have like a relationship with the building, and I've been thinking about it in depth for quite a long time. But in terms of collecting the stories, like it really did kind of happen organically at the beginning. So there was a kind of nice sort of snowballing of that sort of, the way that I think a lot of things happen in rural communities is through word of mouth and, people passing on details and things. And so that kind of sort of field trip really sparked kind of quite a lot of relationships that people who've still helped support the project and champion the project. And then the Arts Festival was another really important way of getting in touch with people. And twice I just came during the Arts Festival and found a space and then invited people to come and talk to me. And so those interviews, and honestly, I couldn't, you couldn't kind of fit them all in to one exhibition. But what I will try and I'll be able to try and work out with Roscommon Council to kind of put a kind of oral history archive together, because the exhibition is maybe just a snapshot of what I've collected, because it's as I say, a kind of a collage of the old and the new, and trying to create.
So what you have to remember as well is obviously it's just you, Greer, that's doing this project. So while you might think a history of a building like the Royal could be told in 10 different ways, and it could also be told by 10 different people, maybe more, but it's just you, and it's the only time it's ever been done. So people of Boyle will appreciate the effort you've gone into. I mean,
thanks.
We've met 3 years ago when you were putting up posters outside the then derelict Royal Hotel, saying there was an exhibition that was going to be going on at some stage, and that was 3 years ago, and we've met a few times since then.
Yeah.
And you were obviously years before that even here doing this. So it's a long, slow, arduous process for one person to try and encapsulate, from an outsider's point of view, the essence of the Royal Hotel. So, I mean, I've seen, which people will get to see at the exhibition, we'll see the 20-minute video or so that you've put together. I've seen a rough cut of it, and it's fantastic.
Oh, thanks.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it gives the essence of what the Royal was like from the stories of people from Boyle, like Frank Tarby, who's no longer around, Barry Feely, Christy Wynn, and so and so. So I think it is really an important project. What has been the most surprising or interesting discovery that you've made so far in your research into the Royal? Is there anything that stands out?
Yeah, no, I have. I found out some really interesting things, and certainly, about ancient Irish history and ancient Ireland, and the old Brehon laws, and there was a law of hospitality, and that was one of the ways that people just were able to travel from town to town. You'd have this idea that somebody would come and you'd welcome a stranger, and you couldn't really refuse a stranger hospitality. And that particular, a guy called Fergus Kelly, who's written a book about Irish hospitality, I got in touch with him just to say, like, I'm doing this project about a hotel, and I need to understand something more about this ancient Irish law. And it wasn't universal. It wasn't like anybody can walk in at all. It had a class or a kind of status attached to it. So you had to be a freeman. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting, because didn't Mr. Freeman build the Royal? And so in ancient Ireland, there would have been these sort of basically like inns. And if you had one of these, so the more you could give hospitality, the higher you grew in esteem. And I can never do the pronunciation of the Irish, but a Broigoi, it's a kind of a status symbol for being the most hospitable in town. You know, you could keep growing, and you could, if you were, you go to like a master hospitality, and you're like nearly like a poet or a bard or you know, one of the lower kings. And I thought, isn't it amazing that like a freeman, you know, what was there before the royal, we don't know. There was no buildings. It was one of the first buildings on the on the south side of the river. So, you know, maybe historically there was always an inn or somebody who had set up a building there that was giving or, you know, hospitality way before Mr. Freeman thought to build the inn. But yeah, I think there was something poetic about a freeman in ancient Ireland
setting up and it was called Freeman's Royal Hotel.
It was
as well.
called the Freeman's Royal, yeah. So there was that kind of interesting like sort of thread that came through from ancient history. And then in more recent times, there was just lots of really sort of, just really lots of kind of anecdotes or important times that people had in it. Barry told me this nice anecdote about a guy that used to come, a commercial traveller, who would visit him, and they'd go for dinner in the Royal. And one time he visited, he wasn't feeling very well, so he decided to go to bed early. But he had asked reception to make sure to wake him. I think, I don't know, did he have to get a train or he had some appointments or something? And then, you know, the next day he wakes up late and comes down and says, you know, what? Like, why didn't you wake me? I was supposed to be at my appointment. They said, you know, oh, you looked so sick. We just thought you needed a lie-in. And, you know, so he sort of both was frustrated, I suppose, that he'd missed his appointment, but also there was an endearing quality to this history and a time when Boyle was really buzzing and there was lots of commercial travellers, that the Royal was almost like a home from home, and they had a commercial room and they had their desks, and I'd hear stories about certain commercial travellers, and the staff would think, oh, he's a nice guy because he always gives you like the 6 shillings or whatever the tip would have been. But that kind of relationships that people would have had with the staff, that seemed, from what I've heard, to always be an important part of the rural local hotel, is that relationship and the relationships between the people inside and then the people locally.
As opposed to the kind of hotels these days that are built. They don't have the same aura or qualities about them. It's, there's no atmosphere in a lot of them. Yeah,
I think when people used to come, certainly when the business travellers, and even then, you know, when I heard about the idea that the nature and the fishing and the hunting, that was a huge part of the draw for not commercial travellers, but sort of tourist travellers, and that they'd come back, year after year. So there was something about that returning again and familiarity, and it being a place that people wanted to visit again. You know, you'd have the odd one-off traveller, but quite often there was quite a lot of kind of return visits. And then, you know, I remember there was, you know, there's lots of really sweet anecdotes. I mean, I've made a book. It's called The Guest Book, the Royal Hotel Guest Book. It'll be in the exhibition, so you can come to see it. And it's, I suppose it's a play on the guest book that used to sit on the reception desk. Because a lot of people spoke about that when I'd ask, is there an object that you can think of? When you think of the Royal, what kind of object comes to mind? And a few people had mentioned this big book that would sit on the side. So it's a play on that, and it's a kind of collection of all of the anecdotes and
comments
stories
and people would have
like little.
Are there any of them books available, as in the guest books? I'm sure there's someone locally that has one lying around in
I
an
know.
attic.
I wonder if anybody hears this, would they? I did ask a few people if they had any idea where they might be. I mean, one person mentioned this blue safe that I saw when I was in there. And they said, oh, maybe it might have been in there. And then I realised I hadn't thought to check inside. I just assumed it was locked, but it probably was unlocked. And,
What treasures lay within.
Yeah, I know. God, regrets. Yeah, I think I hadn't come across, hadn't got my hands on one of those books, but maybe they do.
I'm sure there's
exist out there somewhere.
It'd be great, wouldn't it, to see one of them, even if it was the last one.
Yeah, even the last one, because I suppose that some people had said, there was, there's lots of famous people that stayed, and ledgers. Although I'm not a kind of historian, I think that kind of they're the kind of documents that can really help in 100 years from now, even continue to kind of have that story.
So some famous people over the years would have been W.B. Yeats, Maud Gonne, and Maureen O'Sullivan, obviously born.
Maureen O'Sullivan, yeah.
So and there would have obviously been a lot more, but those are of note, I suppose.
Yeah.
And how did you find then, as an outsider, coming in to the community and asking people for their stories? How did the community respond to your call for contributions to the Royals history? Did you find it was loads of people coming up to you, or did you have to kind of like seek them out? And
yeah, I mean, I suppose, as I said, there was a kind of snowballing where I'd meet one person and they'd say, "Have you talked to somebody else?" And I mean, I didn't set out to do a traditional sort of oral history project. And when I looked or listened back to some of my interviews, like a lot of them are just conversations that I had with people like we're having now. It's not, and I tried to kind of never be in a rush, because I realized quite early on that even you meet somebody on the street, and it's a very Irish thing, isn't it? Those small conversations in passing can be just as interesting and telling as, a long conversation that you have with somebody when you sit down. So I've tried to not to seek out, not to preempt what might happen or what people might say or who might come along, but just to try
go with it organically.
Go with organically and just try and have relationships and get to know people. And try to, and I mean, I suppose in the time that in the time that the project has been going, a lot's happened in the world and in my life and in everybody's lives.
True, yeah.
We went through COVID, and I think for those 2.5 years, I think the exhibition and the project might have come to a kind of conclusion. It would have been slightly different if that gap hadn't existed. I spent quite a lot of time during that period in a kind of online archive world, in the kind of Irish tourism. Bord Fáilte, the Irish Film Institute have an archive of Bord Fáilte old videos, and so I really started to understand something about how we speak about our Ireland and how we've narrated to ourselves and also to the world, like who we are and what we want to kind of sell about ourselves. And I think Irish tourism has become and has it's grown steadily, but it's always been a really big part of our identity. And I think in a rural town like Boyle, the fact that the hotel is closed, it's sort of taken away some of that esteem or value from tourism. And I think maybe I understood that a little bit before, but after the gap and after thinking and looking and understanding more about how important tourism is for rural Ireland, because I'm not from rural Ireland, so it hadn't kind of really hit home to me actually how important tourism is until I sort of had spent some time researching and thinking about it. And I suppose that kind of helped me to understand in more depth the importance that the hotel had for the town and how its loss, I suppose, is felt more acutely. Because tourism is, it's about economy, but it's also about people, and it's also about having something in your town that you're proud of. And I think that's something that it's a great, I suppose, thinking forward, I think there's still such an important part about Boyle having all these amazing assets and this beautiful hinterland, as Barry says in one of his, to quote him, and the architecture and the history of Boyle. It still has that great draw for tourism, and it is a really interesting town. And I suppose so I suppose what I'm saying is I don't want to say that just because there isn't any hotel, there isn't this great resource for tourism. It's just about sort of finding ways to communicate it. Whereas before the hotel would have been the draw.
The focal
whereas
point.
Now it's kind of more diffuse, and you can talk about how all the great assets. But so I suppose in some ways that kind of idea, I suppose as well, that across Ireland there's loads of towns that no longer have a hotel and are going to kind of have to reinvent themselves. But tourism, as a person coming in, I found it really welcoming, and everybody was always really generous with their time, as I say. Yeah.
And were there any standout stories or anecdotes that you can share that you found particularly interesting from someone that you talked to or heard about?
I think one of the things, and maybe I should have said this earlier when I was kind of talking about the shape of the project in these rooms, because what came forward, I suppose, as an idea or a structure within the project is, once I'd kind of understood that I wasn't going to be able to tell it chronologically, I decided to think about the hotel room by room. So in the reception, I was kind of thinking about stories of outsiders and people coming to visit, and then in the bar there's a kind of story of a kind of local space where people meet, and music, and the sort of atmosphere of a local space, and then other rooms at the bedroom and the workspaces. So there's stories around people who worked in the hotel, and they kind of formed a sort of space or a collection of stories about the workspaces. But the room with the most stories was obviously the Lockheed room, because that just held all these really important events for people. And more than anything, it was like this idea of the discos and the bands and the zeitgeist of the time, that people were coming from all over Roscommon to come to this hotel. And there was a few, and I can't remember who told them to me, but like the idea that, one night all the windows were open and it was like heaving upstairs and there's a disco on, and because it was like a cool evening, the steam was billowing out the windows, and somebody from a different town or a tourist visiting comes running in to the hotel and it's like, oh no, the upstairs is on fire, and but actually it's just
perspiration.
It's just these people having an amazing time, and the discos and
the floor bouncing up and down was common.
And I think like anybody who's been to a disco as a young person knows like the electric kind of feeling of having this night out. And Brendan was telling me that because he lived up the street, that on a Saturday night, if his windows were open, he could hear the sounds coming from the Royal, and he'd get this.
Brendan McGee?
Brendan McGee, yes, he'd get this, feeling of like, oh yeah, it's Saturday night.
It's buzzing.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic thing that, you'd have the young kids upstairs, really bouncing around to like, great kind of 80s tracks, and then you've got the guys downstairs having their pints of Guinness and having their chats, and there's a kind of multi-generational, multi-purpose to this building, which I thought was just tried to kind of capture that in a way. So there's like there was just little stories that kind of showed me or spoke to how sort of generational change and shift, and how that it kind of had lived through all these generations.
230 years, I think. Yeah. It was like, a lot of stories and history there.
A lot of stories and history.
So moving on then to your upcoming exhibition on the 31st of August, which is going to be in An Ríoga, the former Royal. Yeah. It's going to be on for 2 weeks. Yeah. And what can visitors expect then from the exhibition? Yeah, so there's going to be an opening, a preview on Saturday, the 31st of August from 4 till 6. So anybody who's around, please come down and join us for a drink.
And then the exhibition will be open Wednesday through Sunday for the following 2 weeks. During the week, Wednesday to Friday, it'll be on 11 till 4, and then the weekend slightly later, 11 till 6. And I'll be there for the 2 weekends. So especially welcome people to come down and talk to me and share their stories. Part of what I've done in the guest book, which will be in the exhibition, is leave some pages at the back, because it's not, I didn't have I couldn't create a definitive list of every single person who've worked there. So it's like little snapshots and little bits, but there's a kind of space to write down anything you want or to share some
Good
names
idea.
of people, because there's still a huge, I've only got a little tip of the iceberg, I think, actually. Obviously,
of course.
Given that it's such an old hotel with so much history. But people can expect some, I've made some prints, I've made a video, an artwork, a video work, I've showed you the draft.
Great, yeah, and that's brilliant.
Thank you. It's it'll be playing on a loop, so anytime you come in, it's a 20-minute thing, so you can it'll
anytime during opening hours.
Yeah, it'll be on and going. I've got a kind of collection of objects and things that people have sort of shared with me, and I suppose I'll display them along with some drawings and photographs and things that I've collected. And yeah, just to kind of, I suppose it is a kind of a recollection. So it's a kind of, I want to use the word collage because it's kind of got
a bit
different
of
layers.
everything. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think in the main, what I hope is that people will just find looking at the Royal over the years a kind of interesting thing to do. It's not going to be a chronological history, but I have tried to show the sort of passing of time and how people have the way that people have shared sort of images from different eras, and how the buildings the way that the building looked. I've sort of tried to, the way that I imagine it is the kind of it's an example or representation of how culture and how tourism and how, you know, the town has changed. It's yeah, that it is a kind of emblem of I suppose life goes on and everything changes, you know, nothing stays the same. And although my experience of the building is it looking one way, somebody else's experience of it is their image in their mind is of it looking different and of a different era, and we all have our kind of own.
And you've got some you've got some great footage as well of the Royal, you know, and it looks dark and gloomy in the footage, and I think that's how it was. That's how it was when you took the footage, and I think then from when you hear Christy and Barry speaking and Frank Tarpey about the old days, it kind of almost brings up a sense of nostalgia as well for people like myself who had been in the Royal in its, you know, when I was young, and obviously the generations above, they will always remember what it like, and you give that stark contrast of how the Royal was, and people then will form their own memories based on those images they see on that video. You know, it's great, some great footage there, and obviously there was only yourself doing this project over the number of years. What challenges had you faced while working on the project, apart from maybe the COVID years?
Yeah, exactly. Apart from COVID, I mean, I suppose I feel, you know, a sense of big responsibility to, and you know, I hope that people are kind of are, you know, I'm sure they'll be interested, but that I, as you say, the footage of the building when it was vacant, and you know, it's dusty and it's pretty naked, I suppose is one way of putting it, and I think if the building hadn't been redeveloped and looking new and clean and a new life sort of breathed into the space, I don't think I would have shown the footage, because it's sort of mournful or a little bit. It has a kind of, as you say, nostalgic, but also a sort of, yeah, I think the contrast of the footage of the old building when in the new building, I hope that people can see that it's the idea that I've been trying to look at the kind of granular dust and the crumbling wallpaper and see that as an evidence of a history and a life lived, rather than just just some crumbling bricks or an old building. That actually, I really believe that history is within the dust, and
Sure,
it's
I
there
agree.
within the building. And now that it's been redeveloped, so I suppose the challenge has been that I don't want to disappoint people, or the people come down and they think they're going to find a sort of a traditional kind of heritage exhibition. That it'll be a very, I hope, interesting, but also kind of a more
I think people will be very interested in it, because obviously the Royal is now gone, as we know. And if you weren't doing this, because you can maybe do this from an objective outsider's point of view. If someone was to do it from Boyle themselves, maybe you wouldn't have the same objectivity as you bring to the table.
Yeah,
so people will come and
that.
they'll make up their own decision. Again, they're not coming looking for a chronological timeline, and that shouldn't be expected, because it's one person.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. So in your view then, what would your hopes for the future of the Royal or An Ríoga as a community space? What would you, as an outsider, like to see with the way the building is now, which it looks nice. It is a lovely building.
Yeah.
How would you see that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think as somebody who's been coming in or visiting Boyle since 2016, I think, so relieved to see the building saved, and restored, because there was rumours of it being a car park, or and I think once the sort of idea that the building couldn't ever really be restored to the level that it would need to be at to be a hotel, what's now it's got a new life is a really amazing development, because there's a lovely use of the river, and the gallery space is going to be an important part. I think one of the things that I've and you, I'm sure, have noticed this as well, about sort of Irish storytelling and culture. It's such an important part of who we are and our history. And in rural Ireland, I think that's maybe sometimes has been left to more of the centres to kind of find spaces for that kind of, you go into Roscommon Town, or you go rather than sort of finding a space within each town for their culture. And obviously one of the big things about Boyle, that when I first came and went to the festival in 2016, I couldn't believe that there was a civic art collection in a town, and that there would be an art festival. So arts and culture is so integral to Boyle, and that from the get-go was something that I was really impressed by, is how much. And I think that's maybe why people were so receptive to the project, because they were like, oh, an arts project. Yeah, I mean, arts projects, they're kind of, it's a very kind of receptive community to the arts and culture here. And that's something that started, has been going on for a long time. So if the Royal can be a space for that, and a space that'll be used for, I mean, it's got the facilities there for organisations or for businesses to be able to start.
Keep the doors open of the building.
Keep the doors open and breathe new life into it. And it's if it's been going for since 1792, the fact that it's not hit its stride yet. I mean, it still has so much time left now.
I agree. And I also think
so
that...
it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I think also that your exhibition is on for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And obviously anyone that would like to see it should come down and see the exhibition and the video. But I also think there should be a place, a little corner in An Ríoga, a little place where we can leave some exhibition stuff for people to, because it needs to live on.
Yeah.
Your video, the 20-minute or so video.
Yeah.
It needs to be there for people. Visitors to the town can come and see what was once here.
Yeah.
As you said, it's such an integral part of our town.
Yeah.
We shouldn't forget it. Not that we will, but there should be something there. And your interviews with the people on it is an important part of it. Yeah. And I think it's vital that it remains like that. Yeah. That it's not just shelved and forgotten about.
Yeah.
You know, it's very important.
Yeah. I mean, that's good to hear. I mean, I think I definitely speak with the council about putting in the uncut kind of oral histories, because obviously there's some really nice there's lots of material there, and I think if anybody it's there to be shared. I collected it as a kind of community document, and there's only a snapshot in the exhibition, but I think it'd be great to have that as to find a home for it, so that somebody in a couple of years can do the same thing and go back to those interviews and use them in a different way.
When you go to these places and they have like the headphones and you press a button and you can listen.
Maybe something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. A couple of headphones there that you can press a button and listen to snapshots.
Yeah.
Because as you said, you have a lot of material about the Royal from these characters from Boyle. And you can only show a snapshot, like you said. But you should definitely see if that's possible. It'd be great.
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting to hear people's stories.
And I think if anybody can't make it and wants to see the video especially, that's something I can share. I mean, I don't know where it'll end up, in a more permanent sense at this moment in time. But like, let's say if somebody... And I know people who've gotten in touch, I'll send them all out an invite, but some people live... I think somebody got in touch from Australia. So I'll certainly maybe create a Vimeo link and be able to share that with people from further afield that can't make it back. And obviously anybody who can't make it, that wants to see it, can just get in touch, and I can share that
exactly
with them. Yeah.
So going all the way back then to when you started this project, is there anything you'd change about your approach if you were to be asked, put on the spot, saying, Greer, you've done a fantastic job, which you have. If there's anything you'd change, apart from maybe getting rid of COVID, what would it be?
Yeah. I mean, I would certainly have come to you and said, how do you set up to record interviews? Because mine was a much more ad hoc, and lots of some of the stuff is this. Yeah, I think technically I didn't necessarily know at the time when I was collecting some of the interviews and stories that they would end up in where they were, and I suppose if I'd known that then, would I have collected them in the same way? Maybe not. So I don't want to kind of... I think the process, I can only have done it one way, I suppose, which is that, as I say, grew organically, and I didn't know at the outset what that we would be here today necessarily. I mean, I suppose I might have salvaged some more things when I was in it. Opening the safe, for example. I mean, God.
What if?
What if, God. But at the same time, I think, it was really Adrian, a guy working at the council, he was really generous to let me in. And, every time I asked, could I do this? I got a kind of a funny look, like, do you really want to collect that mouldy wallpaper? But,
it's
go for it.
It's part of the history, exactly.
And I think that the council... and Rona and everybody who have, when I've explained the idea, people have really got behind it. And so you could always have collected more, or could have always been around that little bit more to sort of get that next story. But I suppose...
There was only yourself, really.
There was only myself, and at the same time, when you have a young family, you can't be here every day. Exactly.
And as I said, you did a fantastic job. But it would be interesting if anyone was listening to this, that they have some memorabilia of the Royal that they would like to either donate or even show you to bring it in during the exhibition,
Yeah.
it would be great, because as I said, I'm sure there's people out there that have maybe a cup or a saucer that they know for a fact was part of the royal. That, and okay, they mightn't want to give it away, but bring it in, let you see it maybe, because it is part of, as we said, the history.
Yeah, and I have I'll have a shelf and some space, and there's always room for more things to go up on the shelf. The idea is that it's a bit like, you know, a mantelpiece at home, and you put up the birthday cards or a photograph or whatever. It'll be a kind of just a collection, and if anybody wants to add something to it, then please.
Because even photographs, you know, they can be copied digitally, so that they don't have to give it away or anything.
Yeah,
that's a very important piece as well, because I'm sure there's tons and tons of photos of the royal from communions and confirmations, weddings.
Yeah,
that's, you know, I think all that, if it was able to be documented, it should be.
Yeah.
So if people are listening and have the photos, bring them along. You can speak to Greer, and she can go about getting them copied, so that you can retain the original, and you have a copy of it for a display or whatever on wherever it sits for going forward. Yeah. Well, listen, I think that about covers it all, Greer. Once again, so the website is indiesrooms.org, and the exhibition is on An Ríoga, the former royal, on August the 31st for 2 weeks.
Yeah. The preview is on that Saturday 4 to 6. It'll be open on the Sunday, and then it'll open again on the Wednesday, and do Wednesday to Sunday for the 2 weeks following that. So up until the 15th, Sunday the 15th, it'll close. And I'll be there at the weekends. So if people want to come down and share their stories, I'd love to meet as many people as possible, really, and show them around the show, and look forward to seeing everybody down there.
Well, listen, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation. You've done some amazing work, very, very important work. That in years to come will be realised.
Yeah.
And thank you for taking the time. All those years of coming down to Boyle, talking, meeting up with everyone, it'll pay off in the long term. So thank you very much, Greer.
Thanks, Carla, for having me. It's been really fun.